Hello.
Nice.
Hi.
Brand
Good to
new
see
year. I mean, we've done a few shows now, but it still feels like it's 2021, like starting all over again. I don't know why. Every time, like, this is the year. Things are going to get better.
Things didn't really turn horrible in 2020 until February or March. So really, it's probably, we're
You
getting.
think it'll reverse at that same pace, right? It needs to be a
Yeah.
full year. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think we need to measure it, a year from when things went off the rails. So,
But I mean, the benefit of all of that, right, is how much time you've been able to invest in Containers from the Couch and make this show great for streaming, because otherwise we might be traveling and going to conferences instead of bringing this to a lot of other people for free, which is awesome.
it's been great. And one of the things that I've loved about it is, like you said, going to conferences was my whole 2019, it seems like, and my whole 2018. And you get to meet a lot of people, and you get to talk about some really cool stuff and that sort of thing. But when it's over, it's over. But with Containers from the Couch, we're going to be talking to Chris and Sven here, and this is going to live on. You'll be able to continue watching it at containersfromthecouch.com or on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/containersfromthecouch. And you'll be able to, keep watching it, or tell all your friends and they can watch it. This is going to live on for quite some time. So what are we all here to talk about?
Well, you make up the point. Like, the thing I really like about the show, right, is we get to bring people here to then talk to everyone else. And so this is, when I saw Gitpod and I'd used it in the past, I was like, wow, this is a really cool tool. It's container based. I understand some of the fundamentals. I love this like disposable sort of like environments, and it has lots of really cool use cases. So I was like, we need to get them on the show to be able to tell everyone else about it, because it's really cool. And the space is like really hot right now. I mean, there's been some things in the past that have, done this for, you have a IDE and a browser. Some of it makes different trade-offs and different assumptions on how you're going to use it. But I wanted to bring Gitpod on just because I've been using it personally last year and thought it was really cool. And I think was there a KubeCon talk, or there was a recent talk that brought it to my attention that you all were going around talking about it more.
Yeah, we had a CNCF meetup talk, and we were at KubeCon, had a virtual booth, and gave a talk there.
Yeah, so go ahead and introduce yourselves. What do you do at Gitpod, and tell us a little bit about what it is.
Right, I'll kick things off then. My name is Chris. I'm chief architect at Gitpod, and so I'm responsible for sort of keeping, let's say, technical cohesion across the different things that make Gitpod tick, and also lead the engineering team. So make sure that not everyone has to think about what to do next, and there's a steady stream of things to do.
Nice. And Sven?
Yeah, I'm Sven. I am the CEO and co-founder of Gitpod, and focusing on product vision, but also try to get some coding done at times. But it becomes a little bit like less and less. But yeah, still.
That's awesome. What was your motivation for starting Gitpod in the first place?
Before Gitpod, I worked as a consultant and helped, teams building good products, mostly engineering developer tools. Basically, I was very specialized on programming languages, plugins for Eclipse and IntelliJ and stuff like that. And I, whenever I had to, help folks in a project, I need to spend 1 or 2 days in order to get up and running, because stuff was so complicated. And it was not only my time I wasted, but also I had to ask constantly everyone in the team, like, the documentation said, like, I have to do this and that and that. I did it, didn't work. And they say, like, yes, I forgot, it's not updated. And there's like, oh, you are on that operating system. And all these things. That was one part. But then, I mean, that kind of was the initial driver. We had similar projects like that also in the Eclipse space. One is called that does a lot of automated setup and so on. And I think that just makes a lot of sense. When I first looked at web-based IDEs a couple of years ago, being a tool developer, I looked at that very early. I saw, wow, it's super hard to solve this problem, bring this into the browser, because the community at large is actually really building developer tools these days. If you look at what a developer tool is, it's not VS Code. It is the ecosystem of extension that really makes this tool shine. And for instance, Cloud9 was really pioneering the space, but they had a hard time bringing up the decent tool support that everyone would expect. Building something like a JetBrains IDE in the browser is not a trivial task, and you probably don't do that if you are not JetBrains. But with VS Code, this changed a bit because they built all this stuff on top of web technology, and I saw that and saw, okay, we would be able to move that stuff into the browser, and then this part is solved together with something like Kubernetes in the backend. The ingredients are finally there to solve this problem of doing cloud-based development. That really means I can put everything I like about my local dev environment, like the command line tools, but also IDE extensions. I can just write a formal recipe of that, put that into a machine, and get that into the cloud, recreate it every time I need it. And that is kind of the idea of Gitpod.
That's awesome. That's been so great. So we have, if you're not familiar, Justin, my team, our team, we maintain eksworkshop.com. It's one of the workshops that we have for learning about containers. And it has a link, if you ever go and want to, edit eksworkshop.com, it's open source and it's integrated with Gitpod. So that was really the first time that I started using Gitpod, and I really grew to love it. I think it's an amazing product. And I didn't realize that you could run it locally, so to speak. I've always just used the SaaS, the free for open source offering that I built into the repo that you guys offer. And that's been really great. I was wondering, Christian, you're the chief architect. Are you architecting and spending all of your time, working on the SaaS, or do you also then help architect and drive and guide the product that that we can run ourselves locally?
So really, they are more or less the same thing. So we don't have sort of separate product lines where one is the SaaS and one is the self-hosted version. They really come from the same code base. There is some variance in there where the SaaS has some slightly different requirements at times, for example, subscriptions where they come in, stuff like that. But other than that, they really are the same code base. And so whenever we make decisions about what technology to use, what requirements to introduce, and we always do consider sort of SaaS requirements where also scale differs a bit. Like we always like to say Gitpod.io is just the biggest self-hosted installation we know of. And so we always make those trade-offs regarding sort of SaaS and what people would expect when they host it themselves.
Awesome.
And Sven, I liked your differentiate on, an IDE isn't just editing text, right? I mean, like all those plugins, I look at like my Vim config has dozens of plugins because it's just like, well, it's not super useful without actually getting some completion. It's not actually making my development process better. And as someone, like I had gone through the stages of trying lots of different IDEs, right? It was like Sublime to Atom to, VS Code to whatever, like all those cases, it was like, well, these three plugins are missing, so I can't do the thing I wanted, or this one doesn't work the way I want and I can't configure it, or it's not open source, whatever the case may be. Like those are all roadblockers for me to adopt something as my daily driver for, like, I write code in this because I'm familiar with it. It has all the support I need. I feel like Microsoft with VS Code kind of went like that. almost like a backwards route to get something to the browser, right? Like base something on the browser that runs on your local machine. Plugin support, we understand how to make plugins for something like that, and then putting that back into the browser kind of makes sense because those plugins still work. And Gitpod still, is it based on the VS Code engine? Can you talk about like what those plugins, how they work, and what ecosystem you're using?
So we use different IDEs, actually. The point about Gitpod is more like the automation of what we call like a dev environment is not only the IDE part in it, it is everything you need, like the whole user land, you probably need an application server, database, compilers, everything in the right version at that point in your commit history, basically. It needs to be right. And so that's why we write all this up in a configuration that is versioned along your history. And the IDE is just one part of that. And it's cool that like I personally like VS Code a lot and I use it. And I know like it has a market share of over 50%, so I'm not alone. But I know also there are a lot of folks who, for instance, love IntelliJ for Java development. And the point about Gitpod is, we wouldn't want to force you using VS Code if you like JetBrains products. That's not the point. Like we are, we have different ways of opening this up currently. There are, you can provide your own Docker image with your own web IDE. So there are other web IDEs that are interesting. Like Thea is one we've been working on. It's at the Eclipse Foundation. But also Jupyter notebooks, for different use cases, you might want to use a different interface that just suits your needs. So we are totally, not opinionated about that. That said, to get back to your question, we are running VS Code as a default, or currently we are running Thea and VS Code, and you can switch between the two. But our focus is on the automation of dev environments, not on building or recreating an IDE. We think that space, that's a commodity that should be done by the community at large. Whatever tools fit you, you should be able to use them in Gitpod.
And people have strong opinions about their IDEs or what they work in. So it's good to take that position and be very adaptable and just build the mechanism that enables their choices rather than, confining them to a choice that you made for them. So
there's an interesting movement, maybe. I just want to add that. So one thing is web IDEs, right? But then you might think, okay, JetBrains IDE, they are written in Java using Swing, if you know what it is, like as a UI layer and so on. And so how would I run that in the browser? Like there is tag that would do that, but actually that's not really what you want. You want to have your local tool, and then you just want to have the automation and maybe also run the workload not locally, so your machine heats up or you need a powerful machine. VS Code has introduced a really cool SSH mode that would connect your local IDE to a remote container, and then has a certain protocol such that it really feels like everything is local. Just the UI part messaging goes through that channel, and the workload is running on the back end, like your terminals, but also language servers, parsers, everything that is high CPU intensive. And in fact, JetBrains is working on a similar mode because it just makes so much sense. And so that's also something that will be very, very normal for desktop IDEs, that they have this mode. You develop in the cloud, you want to be able to connect to any containers and go there with your IDE and maybe try something, run something, and so on. And so we will, we are just working with these folks and make sure the Gitpod integration is really nice and frictionless. So you have your IDE and you can easily start a dev environment for any branch project you are working on from within your IDE.
That's really cool.
really fits into sort of the larger, like one of the principles at Gitpod, where we try to be orthogonal to stuff, right? We try to be as unopinionated. We want to remove friction, not add it. So with that mode coming to your favorite IDE, we also want you to feel at home, right? We don't want to prescribe how you got to do stuff now that things may be running in a container, but instead you should be able to sort of take what you've built and what you've learned and what you want to use, and just use that in a more powerful but automated environment.
And I think that really shows some of the power of containers, right? I mean, it's just like packaging whatever tools you want in this tar file and shipping that around for either shipping stuff to production or how you do your development locally in your own personal environment. Like local is my browser, everything else is remote anyway. So that's really cool, and being able to combine all that stuff into one area of a container is great. Two questions now. Has anyone actually run Vim inside of Gitpod? Like Go TTY or something? Like I can actually like have a browser that's a Vim based IDE as well.
So what you can do is you have terminals within a Gitpod workspace, so you can just run Vim in there and just maximize that, and you basically got what you described.
Suppose so.
What we haven't done yet is built a sort of IDE image that you plug in, and then you get just Vim in quotes, right?
And nothing else. I mean, that'd be kind of neat. Like have like a Tmux based web instance of like, I can have a terminal, I can have Vim, I can have something else. Now I'm just thinking about it. But
this is what he's going to spend the rest of his afternoon on, by the way.
Actually, when we were thinking about this, how do we want like people bringing in their own IDEs and how should this look like? Sort of Vim really was on the sort of extreme end of the spectrum, right? Because the means of integration compared to something you would have with, say, VS Code, where you have extensions that also are web powered, and we run you open this in a browser, and Vim sort of is on the extreme end of that. So how would you integrate with that? And this really did drive some of our design choices.
Interesting. That's great. And to your point of like needing a strong, like a local dev machine that's super powerful. It's like when I first started, it was like we needed, 16 gigs with so much memory, and we wanted to have as many cores as possible. And now like a lot of my personal development is a Chromebook, and it's just like, okay, well, I open Gitpod and I get a terminal and a remote SSH somewhere else, and I'm fine. Like I don't actually do any compiling or stuff locally.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've even pushed changes to the workshop using Gitpod from my iPad. Like someone opens a pull request and I'm able to fire up Gitpod, do a quick review, see the change, and then merge the pull request. And I'm doing it, over a cellular connection in my iPad. And I love that. I think that's the future. So it's amazing.
Are there any other key things that are different with Gitpod versus something like Cloud9 or Codespaces? We talked about self-hosting. We talked about, container-based workflows. What else?
I think the most important differentiation between every other cloud-based IDE and what we do at Gitpod is probably the notion of disposable dev environments. Like we don't think it makes a lot of sense to just move your local stateful, highly mutual environment into the cloud, and then you go back there all the time and massage it there instead of locally. That it's the same pain, it's the same yak shaving experience. Although like the initial setup might have been driven by a Docker image, you are still super stateful. So we want you to automate the creation of fresh dev environments, so that really like you automate not only the Docker image, but also what should happen after the Git checkout. You are working on different branches on the same project, right? And on the different branches, you might have, an old branch might need a different database even, or has different compiler versions and so on. So you version the configuration alongside with the code. But then the trick is that Gitpod does is when someone pushes a new commit, it goes ahead and pre-builds your dev environment. So we introduced the notion of pre-builds, which really works like a CI system, where whenever there is a new push, we create the container, but then also check out the code. And when you run through whatever you have configured that needs to be done in order to get you into a ready to code state. And then when it's done, we take a snapshot. And then this snapshot is waiting for users. So whenever someone comes along and wants to do a code review on a certain branch, everything is already ready to code there. So you start a dev environment, a couple of seconds later, everything is there, compiled, all libraries are there, all code generation has happened, tests ran through, and so on. So you're really in the state that you want to be, and you don't have to wait. And that's probably the biggest difference.
That's
and
super handy.
We've been talking about it for a little while now. But can we see it? Let's jump in and actually like explore it a little bit and see kind of what's possible.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah,
I'm going to jump to your screen, Justin, or should
I was going to show this off as a great video that I watched, understanding how Gitpod allows you to do things that you typically can't do inside of a container, or at least you don't want to let a third party do inside of your containers, right? Like running root and Docker commands. I can throw this link inside the chat here. But it was a really cool walkthrough on just like what enabled Gitpod to allow essentially like Docker. Like I can go to Gitpod and I can still run Docker commands, because even without a VM, because of user namespacing and because of just the security around what a container can do, you're able to architect Gitpod to allow you to do some of the things that is typical for a VM without actually needing to provision full VMs for people.
That's really cool. So whose screen should I go to for the demo?
I can do an overview demo showing you how Gitpod generally works.
Okay, awesome.
You see my screen?
I see Spring Pet Clinic.
Yes, all right. So that's the go-to example for me for the demos I do. It is a Java project. Gitpod, as we mentioned earlier, is not opinionated about any kind of whatever tools, languages, whatever you want. You should be able to create a setup. So this is a Java web application, and the basic idea is with this pre-built dev environment that Gitpod provides, we can even use the context you are at. So here, this is kind of the default branch. But what I also can do is I can, for instance, go to an issue and say, hey, this issue is interesting. I want to work on that. And then I can go into a dev environment from there. And what you do is, like, you see this button here. This is provided by a browser extension that I have installed. It basically goes into the internet and adds this button whenever it sees kind of a valid Gitpod context, which is GitHub pages, pull requests, and so on, but also Bitbucket and GitLab. I mean, for GitLab, we don't really need it because I can show you later, GitLab has native integration. But what this button really does is it does nothing else than prefixing the URL with Gitpod IO hash. So that's all the magic. You are sending the context URL to Gitpod, and I'm entering it. And now Gitpod is reading this context here and trying to figure out what that is, like looking at the project, understanding the configuration in there, and starts you a dev environment based on that. And so, yeah.
Does it read all the way down to, you had the issue number in the URL. So is this going to be an environment that's built specifically for this one issue?
It will, it will say, like, for issues, it assumes you want to start from the default branch.
Okay.
So it takes the pre-built from the default branch, but then, as you can see here, it assumes you want to work on that issue, so it creates you a local branch. Nice. With some default naming
that includes that issue number. That's really cool.
So that's the context for issues. If you look at a pull request, for instance, it will of course check out the particular branch, but then also open the UI in the diff view, so you can easily you see the changes. You can go through them in diff editors, and even comment inline and do a code review from within the IDE.
That's really cool.
the URL, which I think is just super fast. Just do gitpod.io hash whatever.
Mhm.
Where is that supported? That's GitHub. That's GitLab has that support as well. Are there other sites that it's supported on?
Bitbucket.org is also supported. And then every self-hosted version of GitLab. I mean, you have to install the OAuth app first, but then that's also supported. And theoretically, you know, we have architecturally, we can build any kind of integration. We are just, you know, focusing more on depth versus breadth here. So
yeah, I think it's super fascinating, the OAuth seamlessness of it as well, where it's like I didn't need to do a whole bunch of other stuff to like, oh well, now I need to go find this, you know, token and go over here. It's just like, oh yeah, you're logged into GitHub because you're here. Let's use that as your single sign-on and give you the environment. That's super slick.
yeah.
In self-hosted, that obviously also works with whatever installation you have in-house. So if you run your own GitLab installation, you can connect a self-hosted Gitpod installation to your self-hosted GitLab installation, of course.
Nice.
All right. And so in my case here, it's just a, you know, plain VS Code. As I said earlier, you have the choice between 2 different IDEs. Thea, which is very similar to VS Code, or stock VS Code. And basically you can do here, you know, all the stuff you would, I don't know, you would do locally in VS Code. It's basically really the same. So we have the full project here. You see in this terminal, something is already running. Like that is the web application server. And if I scroll up here, you also see there is this message. And it says you just saved 4 minutes watching your code build, because this is a Java project. So it ran a Maven build before it could start the project. It needs to download dependencies, compile the source code, and so on. And this, for this example project, takes 4 minutes. But as I said before, this is done in a pre-build, so you don't have to wait for that. And it is immediately there. So I can start. This is the web application under development. I could just, you know, use that, and here I could go in and change code as I like. And once I'm done, I can go here to the changes and, you know, look the diff and stage it, commit it. And so it's really like our focus is on workflows. You are starting off from an issue, you're solving it, you're pushing back, you're creating a PR. And then, you know, it's someone else comes along, looks at the PR, starts the dev environment, does a code review, and provides feedback. And so when I'm done, all I do here is just, you know, close the tab, and I don't have to care. I don't have to go back to this dev environment anymore. Gitpod understands, okay, you are done. You know, waits a few minutes in case you want to go back and it was an accidental close, but then it will, you know, shut down the container and it will save it. You know, you don't lose state. It's not really ephemeral, but we want you to treat it as ephemeral. Like we don't want you to, you know, I can go, oh, this is the wrong URL. I can go to the workspace list and I see, okay, there are 2 workspaces running and I could reopen it. But, you know, you don't really have to. And then there's also a garbage collection algorithm that eventually will really delete old workspaces that you haven't gone to in a long time.
That's awesome. We have a question coming in from YouTube. Felipe Cruz wants to know if the project you reference in the URL is Golang, does it mean that Gitpod will run VS Code with Golang and all the tooling needed to build the project? And I think I know the answer, but please, let's hear it from the source.
Yeah. So it doesn't do a lot of stuff magically on purpose. Like we don't think it is great to to do the wrong thing, like, you know, guessing at a project and then coming up with lots of stuff, and then the people are like, oh, that was a nice guess, but it's not, you know, you want to have control over the configuration. But if there is no configuration, we come up with a really decent default Docker image that has all the tools you probably need. And of course, VS Code, stock VS Code already comes with suggestions. If you open a file, it says like, yeah, you probably want to install this extension and that. And for Golang in particular, actually, we already also, we run the build and so on, because it's pretty clear there. But yeah, for us, it's important that you really take care of the configuration and version it. I think that makes more sense.
I was about to say, you mentioned configuration a time or two, and my experience has been that configuration lives next to your code. And so just like with your CI process, where you might have a YAML that dictates how your CI should run, you have a Gitpod YAML that dictates how your Gitpod should be configured. And I just love that, because it can be very project specific, but then there's you in control of what the setup should be. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and I wanted to show you a real world example, not a really super simple Spring Pet clinic, but that's why
I pasted in chat my configuration for my personal blog, which is a Hugo site, static sites. So I have, it's on the screen there too for people. But all it does for me is like I made a Gitpod Docker file to install Hugo, the binary, and then I have a command that runs when I start the instance to give me a web server off of the standard Gitpod URL. And so it just allows me to automatically, I go into that and it gives me a preview pane of the web, what's running. It compiles it. I save a file, it automatically renders it. So I can see the rendered Hugo, template. I used to always do that locally. It was fine to do locally. Now I do it for my Chromebook, and I don't actually need, Hugo or anything else installed. So it's super, super easy to do if you need some of those, simple configurations on what your project needs. One person can do it, add a PR, everyone benefits. It's really nice for a team to work on.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out that this is the GitLab project, like GitLab in GitLab, and so they are using Gitpod as well for development. And so because you can imagine, GitLab is not a very trivial project. Their Gitpod YAML is a bit more involved. So you see, this is the Gitpod YAML they have. And so the first thing here is they point to, the base image they want to have their dev environment running in. So you always, in Gitpod, you always have one base image. You can start Docker within that container, but this base image mimics your local machine. We acknowledge that most tools have been built with one basic machine in mind, and then from there you would debug into Docker or Docker Compose, or you run other technology. And so you specify that with all the tools you need, and then you can provide tasks. Every -me denotes one terminal you want to run on login, and then the commands it should run. There are different phases. The init phase is what runs in pre-builds, and then the command is what runs when you actually start a dev environment. So you would do run the build and so on in init, and then run the dev server, for instance, in command. You can configure ports, of course, what should happen when ports open, and then this section maybe also nicely answers the question that we got earlier. You can tell here what extensions does the team need in order to work on this project. So these extensions.
That's awesome. I love the extensions ability. I'm going to add that to some of my projects.
Yeah, for sure. Because
everyone
has their favorites, but then also, I mean, Sven, you're absolutely right. There are occasions when, like, at a project level, I need these extensions. And so I don't want to make every developer on the team go and figure that out on their own. Let's just go ahead and commit it once, so that every time someone brings up an environment, everything that's necessary is already in place.
Right. Yeah.
At the same time, there are some extensions that you might not want everyone to have, like your favorite theme. And as developers, we're very particular about the environment that we work in. And so you can still do that too. So on top of the extensions that make total sense to share with the team, you can also have extensions that are just for you if you want them.
Nice.
Yeah, it's very, very similar to how, for instance, IDEs store settings. You have workspace level settings that are, part of, you should check them in and share them with the team. And then you have user level settings, and those are things like themes or key mappings and such things. And we allow the same life cycles for these sort of things.
That's so cool. So Jamie SC87 says, is there any way to automatically load secrets in Gitpod? I assume they're asking about. So how do you manage secrets when it comes to getting those into your environment?
So there
Chris?
is a feature, environment variables, that we specifically designed with that use case in mind. So when we store them at rest, they are stored encrypted, and we're careful about how we make them available to the container. And you can configure on a sort of repository pattern, like organization/repository, when you open that repository, if that secret should be available there or not. And
That's
internally,
cool.
for example, we use that to authenticate against our preview environments and our own, Kubernetes clusters that we develop against.
Nice. That's very cool. I didn't know that, and I'm going to have to start rethinking, because I think I have a couple of secrets for the build process and that sort of thing. So I'm going to have to figure out how to, or go back and put them into the Gitpod config so that they're there for everyone that works on the workshop.
So mine, the secrets are tied to users, so it's not something that would live in your Gitpod YAML, but
Got it.
because you don't want to check in secrets into your repository, so they live encrypted on your user.
Got it. That makes
I'm
sense
assuming at
too.
the init phase, right before I log in, I could call out to Vault or something and say like, oh, give me these secrets based on this shared, environment. Either for my, my user token goes into. Actually, that's a question. Is my user variables in the init phase?
So when we don't make those secrets available in pre-builds, because a single pre-build is consumed by many different users, and you might not even know by whom, right? So you don't want to share your secrets with a group you're not sure who's in that group.
That makes sense. So one of the things that this makes me think of is, I know this notion of there's the SaaS, but then there's also on-prem. And if you were running this, for example, at AWS on premises, then you might be able to take advantage of, IAM roles for containers or for works that, for EC2 or something like that, and be able to gain access to different resources inside your account just based on the fact that you're running on, the infrastructure that you happen to be running on. Do you see customers tackling, access level requirements that way?
So in self-hosted, there is a feature that is still very much in sort of, I would say, in development. It's made its way into first releases, but it's not documented, and we're sort of testing this out with people who have shown interest in that. And it's basically a generic auth provider where you can sort of integrate your own OAuth based authentication that you already have. And then based on that, you can pull in secrets that are then made available as environment variables again, except they don't live on the user, but they come from whatever system you're authenticating against. And it's you implement a simple interface that we call to, and you return a structure that includes those values. And so you can tie that into any IAM or other sort of authentication mechanism, authorization mechanism that you have available in your infrastructure already.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. Oh, Christian, I see you've shared your screen. Is there something that you wanted to show us?
So one thing I could briefly show, again, here is that banana. I'm always very happy when I see that because it means I don't have to go and grab a coffee because my code has to compile now. So this is Gitpod in Gitpod. We developed Gitpod in Gitpod workspaces and have been doing so for the last 2 years. Like I don't even think I have working Go on my machine, right? And I write Go code most of my day. The main thing I think I wanted to show in here is, for example, that it can run Docker, right? This has been one of the most asked for features. And so you start the Docker daemon, and it will just bring up Docker. And then in a new terminal, you can just run your container as you would. Actually, resizing this seems to have broken my terminals a bit. But you can just run Docker as you would, and it also even integrates with ports very nicely. So if I did something,
I was going to ask.
that,
I was like, if I run Nginx, does that automatically dynamically? Oh, that's cool.
It does. It will recognize that this port came up, and like now, if I visited that, nothing would happen because there's nothing actually serving this, right? So within my container, I just sort of did the port forwarding to my container. But if I did something in here that ran a server, and I don't have Llama, I don't have curl installed. But if I ran something in here that served this port now, then I would just let me just see if I'm root. Actually, I am.
I'm excited to see what this is going to do.
It's just going to start a web server. This is also one of the big benefits of being on the cloud. Like my container runs on something like AWS, so download speeds are insane. I mean, my internet isn't bad, but it sure is not as good as what you can pull into an Amazon data center.
Absolutely. That was one thing that I remember loving back when we could fly. There were times when I would actually be on, airplane Wi-Fi headed somewhere, and I would be able to continue to work and push changes and, pulling and pushing Docker images. Those are hundreds of megabytes, sometimes, gigabytes, and you shouldn't do that over airplane Wi-Fi. Mm-hmm. But if you're in something like Gitpod, then it's no problem.
Exactly.
I love this port integration too, because I feel like that replaces needs for me, like with ngrok or inlets or something where I'm always trying to route the world back to my laptop. And instead it's like, oh, well, my dev environment's out there anyway, so I can open that port. So that's really cool.
And you also have full control over who gets to see it. So by default, if you start something, like now if I do that, if I start something locally, it's going to ask me, it's going to make that available just to me. So I can do that within my browser because I'm authenticated. But if I did a curl on it from my local machine, for example, it wouldn't work. And then I can say, okay, make this, okay, they're all here. This one, for example, this one is private, right? So only I can see it. Only I have access. I can make this public. And then anyone could access it who has the URL.
That's incredible. That's so handy.
I'm assuming you can also, because it's using cookie authentication. So if it's private to me, if I get the cookie, I can still curl it.
Correct. If you were to get your session cookie, you could put your session cookie in there.
It's me, right? It's just me from a different browser. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
so
really
also
neat.
Things like Docker Compose work and for the better part. So this also really makes automating your setup quite simple. If you already have, say, a Docker Compose setup, you check it out, you do Docker Compose up, and there you go. So I think, that's the short version of what I wanted to show.
For something like an on-prem hosted version, if I have, say, like NFS mounts or something that I want a developer to have access to, is that possible to have that centrally managed and say, okay, anytime this repo stands up, we're also going to mount in these file systems that are external, but we can show them up into the container for people?
So we don't have something like that on a per repository basis. What you could do at the end of the day, a Gitpod workspace is nothing but a Kubernetes pod,
right?
And we give you sort of control over how that pod looks like to some degree. So you can basically provide a pod template, and in there you could add an NFS volume. This would then be available to every single workspace you start in that installation, though. Like it wouldn't be on a per repository basis, but on a sort of per installation basis at that point.
That flexibility is still really cool, though. Are there other things that you are able to just build on top of, like Kubernetes did this, so we're just going to use it that way?
So the ports that we've just seen, for example, what happens behind the scenes is if you open a port, then we'll modify a Kubernetes service to make routing work. And so this was pretty straightforward to build, because all this infrastructure and all this plumbing was already there. We just had to use it. And
That's really cool.
There's a host of other sort of easy use cases that are enabled like that by that. Say you have your own root CAs that you use for debugging and within your organization. You can ship that into every workspace, and you don't have to make sure that every developer keeps those up to date. You just add them to the template, and everyone in that installation gets it.
What do you mean? I've never had problems with certs expiring and every developer complaining one day. That never happens.
Yeah, the same goes for tools. So one thing that is really neat is, for example, we use the same Docker image for our CI builds as we do locally, locally meaning in Gitpod. I have almost forgotten the meaning of to me, local is in Gitpod. I don't have anything. I don't even have Python on my machine anymore. And so it uses the same image. And so if I build something in my Gitpod, I can be fairly certain that it's also going to build in my CI system, because there's no drift in versions between tools.
Is there a way inside of this shared sort of context space to notify people that a base container has been updated? As far as can I pop up something in hey, I have 10 developers working on this, and they do have an older workspace. I mean, I assume I can do that with garbage collection, but if I'm deep in development, it's hey, by the way, new pull went out or something affects you. Is there a way to do that?
So the container that everyone's using is part of your version configuration, right? It lives in your repository. So once you merge that to your default branch, to your mainline, and someone else opens a workspace or does a rebase, then you'll get that new configuration. So if you start, if you review a PR that happened after that change, you'd have the up-to-date state.
All right. So no magic. It's containers, and it's how you rebase a container is how you rebase a workspace. Cool.
Exactly.
So Island Fox, one of our chatters from Twitch, wants to know, how do you test subdomains, potentially wildcards, in development of either AWS Cloud9 or Gitpod, or in IDEs in general? So I guess to try and restate the question, if you were trying to test out access to whatever IDE you're working on, whatever API you're working on, or something like that, how would you do that? Is there some routing mechanism where, as you're bringing up services in your Gitpod, you could route things inward to those services and still have, certificates and stuff like that in place?
So I don't think there's sort of a one-size-fits-all answer to that. It really very much depends on the kind of service that you want to consume and that you want to tie in with. What we've seen people do is, at startup, they would register their workspace based on credentials that come from environment variables. And there's a CLI in Gitpod that, for example, gives you the URL of the workspace that you're in, so you can tie that into your task. Or if the service is running on, say, 8080, you can produce the URL for that port. And so you can do something like that in the tasks and then register yourself or download the certificates from the other service.
That's cool. That could be really handy.
Does the templates for Gitpod actually have things like ingress controllers? Could I tell an ingress controller to also route a custom domain to a service?
So at the moment, the templates, we use a load balancer service. There is no ingress control involved at the moment. also by the nature of those workspaces and the fact that you create them very often, the URLs don't stay stable, right? So and you might have, like, I don't know, I have so many tabs open, lost count. And the same goes for my workspaces. I usually have 5 or 6 workspaces open at any given moment, many of which I'll have forgotten, but 3 or so are active. And so if I were to tie that down to a single domain that was installed in some test system, I couldn't do that because which workspace should get that very scarce resource.
Yeah, that makes sense. And these ephemeral URLs then look like they are a good way to go. And ultimately, if you just keep in mind that you're working on one service, right? Typically inside a Gitpod. So if you wanted to send traffic to it, send it to localhost from Gitpod, or if you needed to hit it from some external source, then what you showed us earlier to expose it publicly would certainly be in the cards as well.
Yeah, and external services are also aware of these new ways of doing development. For instance, Auth0, they introduced a mode where you could use wildcards for the callback URL. So it works nicely with Gitpod. They had, in the beginning, they only had like localhost as a special case. But now they also have these wildcard modes where you can, if you are behind a reverse proxy or so, you can use that. And that works pretty well with Gitpod.
Very cool. Well, we're running up against
final question I have.
Yeah.
Is there a way to increase resources available inside of a pod, whether that's self-hosted or through the SaaS service? Like hey, what you give me by default is great, but I want to do something more. My service is huge. How does that go?
I can answer the self-hosted question. Let Sven answer the SaaS one. No, that's not fair. Sven, you go.
So the answer for the SaaS version is unfortunately not yet. But it's pretty high on the roadmap. But I also said that the resources you get are quite, it's containers and they are beefy and so there's a lot of resources you can use already. But yeah, definitely it makes sense going forward to eventually allow people to get some extra power if they need it.
Right. I'm not complaining right now. I mean, I use a great free service for a static website blog, but in previous jobs, I definitely know there'd be cases where it's like, I need some more power behind this. So, I mean, that's assuming the self-hosted path right there.
And it was what I thought of when you brought up earlier Jupyter Notebooks. I was like, oh, yeah, that's gonna need some power behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in self-hosted, you have complete control over how big a workspace should be with, along all the sort of resources that you can configure within Kubernetes 3D. It's basically a Kubernetes resource spec, as you would know from any other pod.
That's really cool.
That's great, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining today and showing us all about Gitpod. I love that this is an open source project, and I didn't know until today that you could run it, that you could self-host it. So I think that I'm definitely going to have to go off and experiment in that direction. Like I said earlier, I've been a Gitpod user for a long time, but I was only using it in my open source project, not exploring it deeply and where I could take it from a self-hosted perspective, or from a using it in every single project that I work across. So now I'm going to have to definitely go and check that out. So it's been awesome.
Thanks. It has been a pleasure for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for
Super
having us.
nice.
All right, cool. Well, if there's nothing else, then we're gonna sign off, and we'll be back. Justin, do you remember what we might have coming up on the schedule?
I have 2 streams next week. I forget the days. I want to say it's Wednesday and Thursday. One is with HashiCorp boundary, and the other one was with the Datadog container report that got published last year. We want to go through some of the stuff and talk about some of their findings.
Nice. So definitely subscribe, especially on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/containers from the couch. Watch for tweets from us to remind you about those upcoming shows next week. And otherwise, hit us up on Twitter if you have any questions, and we'll see you next week. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.